Continuing on in the 5th chapter, Beyond the Wall. Then you believe that your sister may not be living? Nancy interposed soberly. No, Flossie must be alive, Mrs. Fenimore replied with quiet conviction. Otherwise, in all these years, I would have had some word of her death. Tell us about your sister, urged Lieutenant Masters kindly. She was younger than you? No, Flossie was 7 years older. Our parents died when we were very young, and we lived with an aunt who was pretty strict. I never minded Aunt Matilda's scoldings, but Flossie was high-strung. She took dancing lessons secretly, and when Aunt Matilda punished her for it, she ran away. For several years, Flossie danced wherever she could get an engagement and studied during her spare moments. She changed her name to Floriana. Oh, she worked hard. I never saw anyone more determined to get on in the world. You saw Floriana often after she became famous? Inquired Lieutenant Masters. Only now and then. But she wrote to me every week without fail. I was so excited when she became engaged to Walter Heath. It was a secret, so of course I told no one. You have no idea why your sister went away? Asked Nancy. She needed a rest, that's all I know. Flossie didn't tell anyone her plans. The speaker's voice had become soft and dreamy. Could anything have happened between Floriana and Walter Heath to make her unhappy enough to disappear? Speculated Nancy. Mrs. Fenimore shook her head. Floriana never hinted of such a thing. She was beautiful and talented. He was handsome, wealthy, and very kind. They adored each other. No, I'm sure he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Mention of the deceased estate owner reminded Nancy of the real purpose of her call. Accordingly, she asked Mrs. Fenimore about the strange identification clause in the Heath will. I wondered myself what that meant when I read it, the invalid replied. The only thing I could figure out was that Walt and Floriana must have shared a secret. Do you think Hector Keep might know what it was? Nancy asked. Mrs. Fenimore's face darkened. Please don't mention that man's name, she requested sharply. Don't you like him? I detest him. All these years he's pretended to search for Floriana. Pretended? Well, I can't prove it, but I'm sure he's not honest. From the beginning, he assumed that Floriana was dead. He made only half-hearted attempts to find her. Now he doesn't even try, and Mrs. Fenimore suddenly slumped in her chair. Both Nancy and the policewoman jumped forward to catch her as she fainted. Water, the lieutenant said tersely. This has been too much for her. Nancy flew to the kitchen of the little house, returning a moment later with a glass of water. The policewoman had laid the inert victim on the floor of the porch and was taking her pulse. Now she whisked a tiny first aid kit from her pocket, crushed a tablet from it in the palm of her hand, and held it to Mrs. Fenimore's nostrils. In a moment, the invalid revived and was given the water to drink. It was foolish of me to faint, she said as they assisted her to the couch in the living room. Perhaps we better not talk any more today, suggested Nancy. I'm all right now, Mrs. Fenimore insisted. I'd like to talk. Isn't there something we can do to find my sister? She asked pitifully. The time's getting so short. In less than 3 weeks, the estate will go to the county. I don't care about myself, but Joan needs so many things that Floriana could give her. Surely there must be some clue to her whereabouts, Nancy said thoughtfully. A clever person should be able to find your sister. If only someone could make an honest effort. Mrs. Fenimore's voice became pleading. Won't you help me, Miss Drew? I'm afraid it's too big a job for me. Oh, no, it isn't, Mrs. Fenimore insisted. I read about your work. You're the very one to find my sister. I hardly know what to say, Nancy demurred, glancing toward the policewoman. Lieutenant Masters gazed at the girl with a challenging smile. Why not say yes? She asked softly. From the first I've known that this was a case for you. If you work fast, you may find Floriana in time to save Heath Castle. Chapter 6, Exploring the Inlet. Nancy promised Mrs. Fenimore that she would do everything she could to trace her missing sister. Secretly, she wondered whether she would be able to find the dancer in time to save Heath Castle for her. "May I see a photograph of your sister?" she requested. "I have a number of excellent ones," Mrs. Fenimore replied eagerly. "They're in the drawer of that table." At her direction, Nancy got them. There were 6, taken years before when the dancer was at the height of her career. Several were inscribed with her name and a greeting. The face was a distinctive one. Carefully, Nancy noted the perfect features, the beautiful dark eyes, the straight nose and firm chin. "Floriana, doubtless, has changed a great deal since I last saw her," Mrs. Fenimore remarked. "I can't seem to realize that 10 years have slipped by." "Your sister is lovely," Nancy commented. "Joan looks a little like her." "Yes, she does, and certainly my daughter has Flossie's vivacious ways," the woman replied. "She's quite a little actress. Maybe someday." As the invalid looked dreamily into space, Nancy was afraid she might faint again. Fortunately, Mrs. Fenimore regained control of herself. Lieutenant Masters, fearing the conversation had upset the woman, said they must leave. "Please try not to worry," the Drew girl urged Mrs. Fenimore. "I'll start working at once on the mystery." When she and the woman police officer reached the automobile, Nancy declined a ride, saying that she would like to walk and think about how she would start solving the strange case. The lieutenant wished her luck. "Call on me anytime I can help you," the young woman urged as she drove off. Nancy wandered up the street. Children were coming home from school to luncheon. Some of them smiled in a friendly way at the girl, but many of them were rude. "It's too bad Joan has to live in this neighborhood," Nancy thought. "I wonder." At this moment, she spied the child playing with an older boy in a vacant lot. They were tossing a ball for a stray dog to retrieve. "That boy looks familiar," Nancy thought. "Where have I seen him before?" Suddenly, the boy, in a fit of temper, hit the dog with a stick. Joan screamed. "You ugly, mean brute," he shouted. "You're chewing my ball to pieces." Nancy paused. "Stop that," she ordered. "Is that a nice way to treat a dog? He hasn't hurt your ball. He was only playing." The boy, who was ragged and dirty, gazed at her with hard, unfriendly eyes. "Is he your dog?" he asked impudently. "Why, no." "Then it's none of your business if I hit him. I'll do it as often as I please. So." Nancy started to reply, but it was not necessary. The dog dropped the ball and slunk off. The boy picked it up. Giving the girl a baleful look, he too went on his way. Nancy, taking Joan by the hand, led her off. As tactfully as possible, she suggested that the child ought to find a girl playmate in the neighborhood. "Jetty Hooker's the only one that lives close to me," Joan replied, skipping happily along beside her companion. "I don't like him when he's cruel like today, but most of the time he's lots of fun. He always thinks of things to do." "Why didn't you go right home to lunch?" Nancy asked. "Your mother's waiting for you." Joan hung her head. "There's nothing good in the house to eat." Nancy turned into a store, bought some sandwiches and milk, and told the child to take them home at once for her mother and herself. "Oh, thank you, Nancy Drew," Joan beamed. And I won't play with Jetty anymore if you don't want me to." "That's a good girl. And please try to find my aunt for me." "I will," promised Nancy, starting in the other direction. Until they were out of sight of each other, Nancy and Joan continued to turn around and wave. Nancy was sure she had made a firm friend of the little girl. "I'm not very far from me Hardy's," the young detective thought presently. "I believe they'll go there and find out if he's seen that man who crashed into my boat." She turned down a side street, and in a little while she came to the clam digger's home. The old sailor was on the shore repairing his rowboat. "Well now, my lass, I'm glad to see ye," the old sailor said. "But I'm afeard I haven't got good news for ye." "You mean about the boat?" "I've looked high and low for that damaged boat," the old man told the girl regretfully. "It's not tied up anywhere along here." "How about the inlet?" asked Nancy. Hardy admitted that he had not been there. "Too busy," he explained. "Maybe I'll go this very afternoon. I need a mess of clams, and there might be some up in the inlet. You want to come along? I'll show you the Heath factory if you want to see it." For Nancy, the opportunity was one not to be overlooked. Despite her misadventure for a few days before. She was eager to revisit the spot. Just tell me when to be here, she accepted eagerly. To his reply of 3 o'clock, she added, I'll bring along one of my friends. Nancy hurried home, ate some lunch, and telephoned to George. Promptly at 3 o'clock, the two girls met Mihardy at the waterfront. I'll put you to work, he chuckled as he gathered together his fishing and clamming equipment and asked them to help him load it into his rowboat. Presently they were skimming along the tranquil waters of the Muskoka River at a rapid rate, for the old man had muscles of iron. Behind the craft there trailed a long copper wire which gleamed in the sunlight. I'm trolling for my dinner tonight, Mihardy explained. There's something yanking on her now, I do believe. Resting the oars, the old man pulled steadily on the line. A 4-pound bass flopped into the boat, wriggled from his grasp, and landed in George's lap. Oh, she exclaimed, jumping up and brushing water from her dress as Mihardy apologetically took the fish. While the girls kept the boat from drifting downstream, the man removed the fish from the hook and dropped it into his basket. Then he wound up the copper troll line and put it away. Fishing's not much good in the inlet, he remarked, but we'll find clams there. The upper river was very still. As the little boat slipped into the inlet some time later, there was no sound save the occasional chirping of a bird. Hunching low now and then to avoid the overhanging bushes, Nancy watched the coves for hidden boats. There were none, and there was nothing to indicate that anyone had been near the inlet for weeks. It don't look as if we're going to find your friend, Mihardy remarked after he had rowed a quarter of a mile up the stream. We're nearly to Heath's button factory now. I'll anchor here. The old man had located a bed of clams in the shallow water. Asking the girls to balance his woven basket on the gunwale, he waded in to dig the clams out of the mud and sand. As he tossed them, some landed in the basket. Others the girls caught and threw in. All the time, Mihardy kept singing snatches of familiar sea songs, but each one ended with clams by the bushel, clams by the lot, clams for the kettle, clams for the pot. Basket's full, Nancy called in a few minutes. As George caught the last one, she held it in her hand to examine it. The clam looked different from the others. The next instant she stared in astonishment at an ugly purple stain on her fingers. Her dress looked as if it had been splattered with dye. Goodness, she exclaimed in dismay. Where did that come from? Mihardy splashed over to the boat. He looked surprised when he saw George's stained hands. That purple color is a dye, he explained. It came from this here whelk. So this kind of mollusk is called a whelk? Nancy asked. That's right, Mihardy replied. It was not the shell, he told the girls, but the body of the animal inside that produced the dye. Real dye? Nancy inquired, deeply impressed. The very best to be had. Whelks have been used for dye making ever since ancient times. Used with purpuras or dog whelks, they make the finest dye ever. This here whelk is the kind you can eat, too. I'll not try eating any, said George with a grimace. She attempted without success to wash the stain from her fingers. Is it difficult to make the dye? Anyone can do it. You break open the shells and remove the little animals. Soak them in salt water for a few days, then boil them in a lead kettle until you have a pale green liquid. Green? Nancy asked in surprise. Yes'm, the liquid is green, but when you dip wool into it, it comes out purple. I'll buy my clothes already dyed, George said, grinning ruefully. Whelks aren't used commercially here at River Heights, are they? Never heard of anyone going into the business. Whelks ain't plentiful enough around here. Mihardy got into the boat and started off again. As they rounded a bend, the girls saw a large square building set some way back ashore. The banks nearby were littered with discarded bits of clam shells. That's the Heath Button Factory, Mihardy identified the place. She's sure gone to pieces since I was here last. Nancy gazed curiously at the neglected brick structure. Vines lay thick on the shingle roof, and all the windows were broken. Not expecting to find anyone around, she was surprised to see figures close to the factory entrance. We'll end here.